A giant helmet falls from the sky. A creature assembled from corpses opens its eyes. A count drinks blood. A potion splits one man into two bodies. And a portrait ages while its owner stays young. These are the images that survived 5 novels and centuries of adaptation. They're also the moments when each novel becomes recognizably Gothic. Each arrives inside a world that was already failing. Otranto inherits a stolen title. Frankenstein abandons responsibility. Dracula scatters knowledge across institutions. Jekyll divides himself. Dorian mistakes beauty for ethics. The supernatural makes those failures impossible to ignore. For centuries, we've remembered the special effects. This is what they were pointing at. Put the adaptation histories of these novels side by side, and a pattern starts to emerge. The Castle of Otranto becomes a ghost story about supernatural justice, with a usurper haunted until the rightful line is restored. Frankenstein adaptations make the creation the defining event. James Whale's 1931 film gave cinema one of its greatest images in the laboratory, and the adaptations that followed kept returning to the moment the creature comes alive. Shelley placed the decisive failure immediately afterward. Victor looks at the being he's made, discovers that his experiment produced a living obligation, and runs. Dracula undergoes a similar change. Stoker constructs the novel from journals, letters, newspaper reports, medical records, telegrams, and even phonograph recordings. No single character possesses the story. Understanding Dracula requires information to move between people and across institutions until fragments become a picture. Film can bypass that problem entirely. The camera goes where the characters cannot, shows what they do not know, and turns a novel about assembling a threat into a story organized around the vampire himself. Jekyll and Hyde acquired this defining spectacle before cinema had even arrived. Richard Mansfield's 1887 stage adaptation made the transformation the center of the story, and later versions increasingly presented that transformation as something Jekyll suffers. Stevenson begins somewhere more deliberate. Jekyll drinks the potion because Hyde offers him something he wants, and he continues drinking it long before the transformation becomes involuntary. Compulsion is where the process ends, after choice has spent years constructing it. Dorian Gray offers perhaps the most irresistible image of all, the young face beside the ruined portrait, followed eventually by the unveiling. The canvas becomes a supernatural record waiting behind a locked door, and the revelation of what it contains becomes the event towards which the story seems to move. Across 5 separate traditions of adaptation, the supernatural device gradually acquires the explanatory weight of the novel around it. Creation explains Frankenstein. The vampire explains Dracula. Transformations explain Jekyll and Hyde. The portrait explains Dorian Gray. The haunting explains Otranto. Once that happens, the mechanism through which each novel exposes its problem starts to look like the problem itself. Repeat the process across enough books, films, stages, posters, costumes, and classrooms, and eventually the mechanism starts to look like the genre. Across all 5 novels, the supernatural makes an existing contradiction concrete. A disputed inheritance becomes a body filling a castle, abandoned responsibility becomes a creature that can return to its creator, institutional fragmentation becomes a predator moving between systems of knowledge, social division becomes another self, moral consequence becomes a portrait. That is what the supernatural contributes to Gothic fiction. It gives something dispersed across history, institutions, relationships, social codes, or even ideas enough physical presence to act inside the story. This is the 6th and final episode of the Gothic series, part of an ongoing project on how adaptations and cultural misunderstandings change the warnings their authors were making, and exactly where those changes happen. The full dystopian series is already on the channel, and Shakespeare starts next. Subscribe so you don't miss Macbeth and the rest of that arc, or join as a member for the full 80+ video backlog. The supernatural belongs partly to the historical moment that produced it. Galvanism carried possibilities for Shelley's first readers that it cannot produce for us exactly. The anxiety surrounding degeneration, criminality, sexuality, and professional respectability that shaped Stevenson and Stoker belong to the particular 19th century debates. Walpole's obsession with inheritance and legitimacy emerged from an 18th century world in which aristocratic title and property carried political meanings specific to that order. Those contexts matter because they explain why each novel required the supernatural device it chose. They also explain why the device can survive long after the conditions that originally gave them force have changed. The problem made visible through them are less historically contained. Institutions can still become incapable of recognizing problems that fall between their areas of expertise. Systems of inheritance can carry the consequences of decisions made generations earlier into a present that treats those consequences as ordinary. Codes of acceptable behavior can create increasingly elaborate ways of hiding whatever they exclude. A philosophy can become destructive when it is asked to answer questions it was never able to. Creating something can produce obligations that survive the creator's desire to be finished with it. None of these problems require us to believe in vampires or animated corpses. The supernatural gives each one a form specific enough to become a story. That distinction also explains why Gothic fiction has been able to migrate so easily. Once the function is understood, Gothic no longer depends on any particular inventory of objects. A castle, laboratory, drawing room, city street, institution, family, or even technology can all become Gothic when the structure that appears to organize them begins revealing what its stability required everyone inside to overlook. That is what gives the genre a life beyond the historical fears that supplied its most famous images. The monsters survive because new audiences can keep finding structures that need them. That closes the Gothic series. The supernatural became the face of the genre because it carries its arguments so well. The problem begins when the face outlives the argument. The full series is linked here with Otranto through Frankenstein. Next, we move into Shakespeare's tragedies, where the supernatural machinery gives way to kings, courts, families, and states confronting the same underlying question. What does a stable world reveal about itself when it can no longer absorb what has gone wrong? We'll start with Macbeth, Lear, Julius Caesar, Hamlet, and Othello. Subscribe to follow the Shakespeare series. Thanks for watching, and stay copacetic.